If you know anything about our immune system, it's probably that its job is to protect us from disease. And that's true. But have you ever wondered how it does this? And likewise, why is it that bug bites and scrapes and even hives all have these similar characteristics? They get red and swollen and they itch. And seriously, what is with the snotting and sneezing every single spring? I could really do without it. It turns out that all of these examples are related. They're all caused by or are involved with inflammation, our immune system's key mechanism for doing, well, everything. And today, to help us understand how it works a little bit better, we're going to dive into the mechanism that is inflammation. Hello, my name is Shelby Bradford and I'm the Geeky Goth. Now, full disclosure, I am an immuno nerd. That's probably the reason why I got my bachelor's degree in immunology and microbiology, and I'm currently a graduate student pursuing a PhD in these same fields. I love learning about how our cells work, how microbes make us sick, and then how our cells keep us from getting sick. But today, my goal is to share this fascination with you so that you can understand how this incredible system works to do all of its important jobs, and maybe also so you can appreciate it a little bit better. Today, we're going over something we all probably have some familiarity with. We've all probably said that something looks inflamed. And if I asked you what that meant, you could probably already give me a good overview of what we're about to discuss. In our last video, we introduced some of our key players in the immune system. We also briefly mentioned this concept called inflammation. We said that this process was how our immune system was going to activate, mobilize cells, and allow them to carry out their responses. But we didn't look too awful much beyond that. This inflammation involved 4 hallmark characteristics: the production of heat, swelling, pain, and redness. What we didn't see was how all of this worked to, well, work as an immune response. So today, we're diving into the strategy that is inflammation. Every single immune response is going to kick off because some component of the immune system recognizes some potential threat. So that's what we have depicted here. Right here, we've got some immune cell, probably a granulocyte, because as I've tried to depict, it's full of these granules that we mentioned in our last video. And it is recognizing some potential threat here. Now, this could be a lot of things. It could be a pathogen. This is a disease-causing organism. So your bacteria, your viruses, your parasites, so forth and so on. Or it could be an allergen, good old pollen and the like. Conversely, it could be an actual cell of our own that is either damaged or infected or even cancerous, because our immune system is going to recognize those as well. Any of these are going to have some specific molecule that the immune system can recognize, and that molecule is called an antigen. Now, this interaction is pretty unique and involves a lot of other molecules that we'll have to discuss in a future video. But pretty much, we've got an agent that has an antigen that the immune system can see, and that initiates an immune response. So, what happens next? Next is where we see the start of our inflammation. So this granulocyte is going to release those granules. Now, we didn't get to really talk about them a lot in depth in the last video, but these are a plethora of different types of molecules. So we've got cytokines. These are usually proteins that are going to modulate the immune system somehow. We've got histamine, which of course every allergy sufferer is well acquainted with. And then we've got other molecules like eicosanoids that are really important in driving all of these inflammatory responses. However, there are so many other granules that we just don't really have a place for today, but a lot comes out of these cells. Things like heparin and antimicrobial products and proteases and on and on and on. But for today, for this video, we're going to focus on these 3 big categories: cytokines, histamines, and these eicosanoid products, because each of them are going to be involved somewhere in these 4 characteristics: our fever, swelling, redness, and pain of inflammation. So let's take a closer look. Cytokines are molecules, predominantly proteins, that are sent out from one cell that has recognized something or had some other issue and are sent to a second recipient cell to induce some sort of change, some sort of response. However, exactly what this message is and what the ultimate response is depends on a lot of factors. Cytokines as a group don't have one set function in the immune system. Some of them are going to make these responses happen more, which we call pro-inflammatory. Others are actually going to work to kind of hit the brakes, which we call anti-inflammatory. But even then, there's sometimes wiggle room. Some cytokines might do different things towards different cells or in different contexts. This is why immunology can sometimes be so complicated. Now, within this big cytokine family, there are kind of subgroups. There's the interleukins. These are designated as IL and a number. But again, some of them work as pro-inflammatory cytokines, others as anti-inflammatory cytokines. For example, IL-1 beta is usually a pro-inflammatory cytokine, whereas IL-10 is a very anti-inflammatory cytokine. Then there are the interferons, where they were first identified as interfering with something. This is usually like interferon alpha or beta, and these are really important in viral infections. But then you've got interferon gamma, which just drives pro-inflammatory responses in other cells. Then there are chemokines. Now, I don't have them pictured here, but if you imagine that this cell is going to follow these blue cytokines to this green cell, that's a chemokine. They're used to help cells migrate to some other place. And then we've got our oddballs. So here on our pro-inflammatory side, we have tumor necrosis factor alpha, and then on our anti-inflammatory side, we've got tumor growth factor beta. While these both were first identified in the context of tumors, it turns out that naming things based on where you first find them is a terrible idea because, as you can see, they work well outside of tumors. So, cytokines work to just regulate immune responses. They can have a lot of different jobs. That's why we always have to keep in mind what it is and what the context is. But let's move on. Now for the molecule that every seasonal allergy sufferer loves to hate. It is none other than histamine. Now, besides making us feel miserable, histamine actually has a purpose. Two of the most important functions that histamine has in our immune response are to dilate our blood vessels and to stimulate nerves. Let's start with vessel dilation. What we have to keep in mind is that our vessels aren't just standalone things. They're made up of cells as well. And these cells are all attached to things like muscles and nerve cells. And if you imagine that my hands are actually the cells of the vessel, when my hands contract, you can see that there becomes more space in the band. And then relax. And then contract. And then relax. Contract and relax. So you see how contracting the cells that make up the blood vessel is going to put more space in that vessel. Now, why is that important? Well, we're going to move more cells through an area where there's more space. And if you want to get cells, like your immune cells, to some specific part of the body in a quick amount of time, you gotta give them a big highway to move on. So now let's talk about histamine literally getting on our nerves. When histamine stimulates nerve cells, it's going to cause them to fire some message to the brain or sometimes just to the spinal cord. Now, what this stimulation by histamine does to our nerves is it causes a sensation of itching. So that's why things like bug bites itch. Why is this important? When we itch things, we damage our cells. You've probably noticed that before. But this cell damage is also a trigger for our immune system, and that's a whole different video some other time. So histamine is going to induce itching by stimulating nerves in an attempt to get more immune cells to the area, to drive inflammation. Now, something else it's going to do is sometimes induce sneezing. So this is more when things are in our lungs and in our throats. Why is sneezing important? Well, when you sneeze, you get things out of your body. So sneezes, coughs, mucus, all of these are just an attempt of your immune system to get rid of whatever trouble it is dealing with. It just so happens to be really gross and inconvenient for us. So the last group of our immune mediators in inflammation that we're going to be talking about today is this family of eicosanoids. There are two main groups of eicosanoids that we're going to focus on. These are prostaglandins and then leukotrienes. Now, kind of like with our interleukins, how I said that there were like a bunch of interleukins, there's a bunch of different prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Some of them are going to be acting to promote inflammation, some of them to suppress it. But right now we're looking at getting inflammation going, and because prostaglandin and leukotriene functions often overlap, we're going to talk about their pro-inflammatory functions together right now. And you'll notice that these also overlap with that of histamine. Turns out that immunology really wanted to make sure that we always had a mechanism to turn on inflammation. That's really important. So very similar to histamine, we are going to be dilating these blood vessels. This is also to recruit cells, namely, like in the case of leukotrienes, our neutrophils, but we want to get immune cells to this site where there is a problem. But in dilating our blood vessels, we cause an increase in heat. So something that we didn't mention in the last segment, the reason why we have localized heat and redness because of this vessel dilation is because when our vessels dilate, they become closer to the surface. Now, our vessels being closer to the surface is the reason why the area looks red, because the blood is closer to the surface. However, our body's heat is moved around by the blood. And so when we put that heat-carrying liquid close to the surface, it now feels warm. Now this is a normal mechanism. When we get too warm, our blood vessels dilate to put themselves closer to the surface to try to get rid of heat faster. It just so happens that when we're trying to dilate them for a different reason, the same effect happens. So going on to their effect on the nerves, again, like with histamines, these eicosanoids are gonna get on them pretty well. But this time, what we can see is that this stimulation is acting on pain receptors. And so this is where that sensation of pain sometimes comes from when you have some given immune response. Now, this seems pretty miserable, but why is pain important? Well, do you go and mess with things or do things that cause you pain? Usually no. If something hurts, it makes you stop. And so this is a very good defense mechanism so that our big stumbling bodies, we're going to give things time to heal. Now, one final effect that we want to talk about right now with these eicosanoids is their effect on our responding immune cells like neutrophils and macrophages. Some of these eicosanoids are going to act on these cells to actually really get them amped up and making pro-inflammatory cytokines of their own. And so we're going to drive that inflammation to increase our immune response activity. So we've now seen some examples of pain, of redness, and of local heat to the area. We're going to get to swelling in a moment, but probably the most archetypical symptom of having a cold is usually the fever. Now, why do we have a fever? So where does the fever come from? Well, remember that group of eicosanoids, prostaglandins? Some of them, either by tapping on those nerve cells or by taking a ride up the circulatory system themselves, are going to end up triggering cells in our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus is where our internal bodily thermostat is held. And this message is going to tell it to bump the heat up a few degrees. It's going to change our set point. Our body's response then is going to say, oh, we need to get warmer. Well, again, remember, it's our blood that kind of helps to regulate how warm we are. So if we need to get warmer, then we need to hold on to more heat. So one of the ways we're going to do this is actually constricting some of our blood vessels. I know, right? We were just talking about dilating them. It turns out that nothing's a dichotomy. Nothing's black and white, all or nothing. Different cells in different parts of the body at different times can respond to contradictory message. Even the same cell can get two opposing signals, and depending on which one is stronger, it's going to probably find a response that's somewhere in the middle. It's just kind of part of biology. So some of our blood vessels in our body are going to constrict, and this is going to move them further away from surfaces so that they aren't losing as much heat. Another cool trick that the body's going to use to generate more heat is actually cause our muscles to kind of twitch ever so slightly. So this is one of the reasons why we feel the chills. That's your muscles twitching to try to maintain heat. But why do we want to get warmer? Two reasons. One, when we warm our bodies up, we become a less pleasant place for pathogens like bacteria and virus and fungi to live. But a second reason that maybe you aren't aware of is that this increase in body temperature, this heat, is a signal to many of our immune cells that it's time to activate. There's a problem somewhere, and they should start turning on and looking out for signals of where to go. So now it's time to see what's happening at the site of this immune response, where we were trying to draw all of these cells into in the first place. Well, they need to get out of the blood vessel if that's how they're traveling, and thankfully, between cell-cell cooperation as well as some of those other granules, like even the eicosanoids, our cells lining the blood vessels kind of become a little bit more leaky. You see, usually the cells lining our blood vessels are held together fairly tightly. They only let just enough fluid out so that the cells in the tissue can get some oxygen. But now we need to move something a lot bigger than just a teeny red blood cell with some oxygen through. We need to get a whole immune cell through, and that's a lot bigger. So the cells in this area actually loosen up some so that immune cells, like neutrophils, can actually pass through them into this area. So we end up bringing in the cavalry. We get neutrophils and macrophages and more cells all drawn into this space. And they're going to take care of whatever this threat was. If it was an infected cell, they're going to kill it and they're going to track down more invaders. If it was a pathogen, they're going to kill it and they're going to track down more invaders. If it was a damaged cell, then they're going to clean up after it. They're going to eat up all the debris and make sure that there's no other potential threats lying around. But there's something else we need to consider with all of this happening. You see, we just said that we're going to loosen up these vessel walls, make the cells less tight so that the immune cells could get through. But it's not just immune cells that come through. Remember, the vessels that our immune cells are using as highways are blood vessels. So there's blood in them. And when these doors open, the cells loosen up some, more blood also leaks through. So we've got a lot of cells and a lot of fluid crowding into a finite amount of space. And that already sounds kind of uncomfortable, but for our nerves, who are also situated in this space, that's unbearable. Eventually, all this crowding, as well as all of the cytokines and granules and pro-inflammatory molecules bouncing around, all of this triggers those nerve cells. And they really are done with being pushed. Okay, so there's actually a lot more cells and molecules involved in stopping all of this inflammation than just some ticked off nerve cells. So as we can see, nerve cells are going to be one of our cells that are going to produce a molecule. Here I have acetylcholine depicted that's going to start to suppress inflammation. But we can see there's a lot of other players involved in controlling and stopping inflammation once it really ramps up. We've got adipocytes that are going to produce this adiponectin. We've got our adrenal glands coming in to produce cortisol. We've got regulatory T cells, which are a special subset of the T cells that would have eventually shown up to our site of that immune response, along with other more inflammatory T cells and B cells and other cells. But these regulatory T cells are going to produce that suppressive IL-10. And then, as we're going to look at a little bit more in detail, we're actually going to get the production of anti-inflammatory molecules from our neutrophils and macrophages that were originally driving our inflammation. So let's take a little bit of a closer look to see how some of this works to shut off our inflammatory immune response. So something that's really cool about how inflammation and our entire immune system is really designed is that it comes with its own built-in brakes. For example, what causes all of these anti-inflammatory molecules to be produced is usually the pro-inflammatory molecules themselves. So let's look at the effect of prostaglandins and leukotrienes on neutrophils as an example. Of course, our neutrophils were being recruited to the site of the immune response, and we said that they were going to produce all these pro-inflammatory cytokines. They were going to gobble up whatever that potential threat might have been. They were, with all intents and purposes, promoting inflammation. But let's look at what happens as this goes on. So neutrophils are one of the cells that would be making these prostaglandins and leukotrienes once they show up beside the mast cells. But pretty quickly after they show up, these very prostaglandins and leukotrienes are going to induce these neutrophils to start making resolvins and lipoxins that we saw in the previous clip are anti-inflammatory. But what do these resolvins and lipoxins do? Well, a couple of things to build off of what we've been looking at are they're going to act on these macrophages that were producing pro-inflammatory cytokines like interferon gamma, and they're going to reprogram them to produce anti-inflammatory cytokines such as our TGF-beta. Another thing that these resolvins and lipoxins are going to do is come back and act on these neutrophils and actually induce what's called apoptosis. Apoptosis is literally a programmed cell death, and almost all of our cells are designed to do this at the drop of a hat. They get the signal and they shut it down. This might seem crazy, but when you think about it, it's like a nifty built-in safety net that the immune system and our whole body has. If things get out of hand, it's nice to be able to just shut it all down. Now, of course, we saw a lot of other anti-inflammatory mediators involved, and many of these, like how we saw with our pro-inflammatory effects, are going to have overlapping functions with these resolvins and lipoxins that we just discussed. These molecules are also going to help turn pro-inflammatory macrophages into anti-inflammatory resolving macrophages, but they're also going to act on our mast cells, which were initially producing all those granules to drive the immune response to begin with, and they're going to put them into that programmed cell death by apoptosis. So what's going to happen next? Well, this is really the resolution period in our immune response. These newly programmed macrophages are going to go around eating up all of this cell debris so that it doesn't trigger any other immune responses. And then they and other specialized cells are going to come in and help to heal the tissue, promoting new cell growth if necessary, and then just kind of survey the area that nothing else is coming in to cause any problems. But ultimately, by getting rid of your pro-inflammatory cells like the mast cells or the neutrophils, or reprogramming them to an anti-inflammatory state, everything kind of takes care of itself. we aren't making all of those pro-inflammatory molecules, so eventually the prostaglandins, the leukotrienes, the inflammatory cytokines are gonna get broken down, as pretty much all proteins and molecules in our body do. And once they're gone and there aren't any more being made, well, all of that signal to, raise the body temperature and dilate or constrict the blood vessels or, become leakier in the case of our vessel walls, those are all going to return to normal. Our body temperature is going to come down, the vessels are going to return to a more normal size, and we will feel less hot, we're going to see less swelling, we'll experience less pain and itching. And that's how a healthy immune response resolves itself all by itself. Now, of course, there are so many more cells and molecules and interactions that are occurring during an immune response like this. I mean, we skipped over the entire actual fight scene between the immune system and the threat. But hopefully you got the gist of what inflammation looks like from its start to its resolution. And it's pretty chaotic, but it's also pretty organized. As soon as it recognizes some potential threat, it's able to immediately activate and mobilize cells, get our whole body situated for this immune response so that it can take care of it all on its own. And then, once it's done, it comes with its own reset feature so that, it cleans up after itself. It gets new cells put into place to replace any ones that were lost. And it puts everything back to normal. I mean, yeah, we feel kind of gross for a couple of days, but I mean, it's not a bad trade-off when you think about it. So that is inflammation in a nutshell. Sure, it feels like a giant inconvenience, but hopefully now you have a better understanding and maybe even an appreciation for the method to the madness, or again, as it often feels, the misery. If you enjoyed exploring this topic with me today, like and subscribe to join me the next time we go on more immuno adventures to talk about more awesome science.